Good morning. Welcome to the Department of Local Government Finance's webinar about the Additional Appropriation Application. My name is Fred Van Dorp. I am the Budget Division Director. The webinar is scheduled to last 60 minutes. Before we get started, I'd like to set expectations for what we hope to accomplish with this presentation. The presentation is not designed to be a comprehensive walkthrough of the new process, but to provide units with an overview of the changes that are scheduled to go live on April 1st of 2020. Following this presentation, a number of user guides, follow-up training opportunities with your local budget field representative, and additional information will be distributed to all units. If you were able to find this presentation posted nearby on the department's website, you should also be able to find a listing of frequently asked questions that we have collected at our first two webinars, along with answers for the more common questions that we have received so far in regards to the new application. Before we get started, we need to agree upon a set of common terms, a set of definitions, if you will, to define where this change is coming from, why the department is rolling out this new method. For this presentation, there's only two definitions that we need to come to agreement on, and that will be an appropriation and additional appropriation. From there, we will transition to doing an overview of the current additional appropriation procedures, followed by the overview of the new procedures, and then just a couple of frequently asked questions that we have staged within the presentation itself. All right. So, for starters, let's begin with defining what an appropriation is. And for this particular slide, it may have taken me longer to create this one than all the subsequent slides in the presentation. And ultimately, instead of landing on a single definition for appropriation, I landed on four. The shorthand, when the department refers to an appropriation, what that means is, when the department refers to an appropriation, what we're talking about is your budget. The appropriation represents your certified spending authority for any given fund for the budget year. Now, with few exceptions statewide, nearly all funds have an appropriation. An example of a fund that wouldn't have an appropriation would be a local gift fund. Now, if you are interested in what your appropriation is or what your appropriations are for the given year, there are two places where you can find that information. The first place is on the DLGF, on the department's certified budget order, which can be found on the DLGF website. What that's going to include are the funds that the department is statutorily required to post a final total for, a place where a location where all units or the public can see what a unit has been approved to spend in a given period. The second place where you can find appropriations are on the Form 4, which can be located either on the public side or on the login side of Gateway. What you'll find on your Form 4 that you won't find on your certified budget orders are funds that fall into a grouping that we traditionally refer to as the non-certified fund. Non-certified funds. These funds include, but are not limited to, funds like local grant funds, or more often, these non-certified funds include any home rule funds that you may have. This marks the first of three times during the course of the presentation where the department is going to separate funds and separate appropriations into those two groups, the DLGF certified ones and then the DLGF non-certified ones. All right. On this slide, we're going to take a look at what that DLGF certified budget order looks like. And while the focus of the slide is going to be the column labeled certified budget, and while we're here, let's take a moment to talk about what else is being presented. Starting on the left-hand side, we've got the DLGF official fund number and fund name. Skipping over budget, we're next looking at the certified assessed value, the total value of all taxable property within a given area. The certified levy column represents the amount of new property taxes that are going to be generated and are pledged towards the appropriation or towards the budget. And then the certified rate is the actual tax rate necessary to generate the amount of levy that's going to go into the budget. But the star of this particular slide for this presentation is the certified budget amount. And from there, if we focus specifically on the general fund, we can see that for this hypothetical budget, the department has certified an appropriation of $18,405 for the general fund. Now, it's an important distinction that while this represents the spending authority for the budget year, this does not necessarily represent all the funds that are available. This general fund may have both a certified appropriation and may have unappropriated dollars in the fund. But let us take a closer look at what that means. During the budget certification process, the department looks at the 5 pieces of information below in order to calculate in order to calculate the budget that we post onto our report. Now, this represents an oversimplification of a very complicated process, but it should give us enough information to provide sort of a baseline of understanding by which we can examine both the appropriation and the additional appropriation process. We will go over each one of these in a little bit more detail, but I do want to clarify what's represented by the number 2, the cash reserves bullet below. Now, cash reserves in this case is going to represent a number of values that are reported on the CYFW or the current year financial worksheet. For the purposes of this presentation, cash reserves is going to stand in for 1, the cash balance as of June 30th, 2, any planned expenditures for the last 6 months of the year that could reduce that cash balance, and 3, the December settlement revenue that will be deposited that will potentially increase the cash balance. The shorthand is we're just going to refer to those as the cash reserves. Okay. All right, so let's take a look at 3 examples of how the department is going to use those 5 pieces of information to ultimately settle on a certified appropriation or a budget for 3 hypothetical funds. The advertised budget, which is published on the Form 3 or the Notice to Taxpayers, represents a ceiling that the unit is instituting on the fund for a maximum appropriation. In other words, by informing the taxpayers of your intent to seek a specific amount of budget, it is the first piece of information the department is going to use in order to set a cap on the maximum budget that you can be approved for during the course of the year. The next 3 lines, our stand-in cash reserves, the miscellaneous revenue, and the property tax levy are summed together in order to calculate how that budget will be funded during the course of the year. The last line listed here as the adopted budget represents a second level of control at the end of the process, after you've advertised, after you advertised a budget, after the appropriate fiscal body has adopted a budget. We can look at what budget they are actually requesting. So there's a second level of control that exists during the budget certification process that gives us more control on that final number. All right. So in our first example, they advertised a budget of 100, so they set their ceiling. They have reported to the department that there are $350 worth of cash reserves. They are pledging no miscellaneous revenue. They are pledging no new property tax dollars to the funds. And the fiscal body ultimately ended up adopting a budget of $100. In example 1, the department could have approved a budget of up to $350, but based on what was advertised and adopted, the department will ultimately end up certifying an appropriation of $100, leaving $250 of unappropriated $250 of unappropriated dollars in this fund. In example 2, they advertised a higher budget of $750. In this example, they've got no cash reserves and they've got no property tax levy that they're pledging toward this fund, but they do have $750 of miscellaneous revenue available to them. In the second example, the fiscal body ultimately ended up adopting a budget that was lower than what they advertised. And so during the certification process, the department would certify an appropriation of $500, leaving again $250 of unappropriated funds. Now, example 3, advertised an even higher budget of $1,000. In this case, they have got 3 different types of revenue that they're going to be pledging towards that budget. A $400 worth of cash reserves, $500 worth of miscellaneous revenue, $100 worth of property tax, and their fiscal body adopted a budget of $1,000. Now, in this case, the department can still certify the budget at the $1,000 that was adopted, but there are $0 of unappropriated funds. Now, this slide is designed to show us, the purpose of this slide is to show us that a unit can have both an appropriation and unappropriated funds. We will be taking a look at example 1 a little bit later in the presentation, but while we have this information up, I want to point out that in all 3 of our examples, the units adopted fundable budgets. That is a term you're going to hear a lot from the department during the upcoming year. It's going to be the focus of future webinars and a number of conversations that you'll be having with your local DLGF field rep. Okay. All right. So if it took 5 slides and 15 minutes to get to a base level of understanding of what an appropriation is, we can do the additional appropriation significantly quicker. When talking about an additional appropriation, what we're referring to is a formal process as outlined by statute that is used to appropriate money in excess of the certified appropriation for the current year. And so in example 1 and example 2 in the previous slide, the additional appropriation is how a unit increases its spending authority over what they originally adopted. Now, in calendar year 2019, the department received more than 1,500 additional appropriations for more than 3,000 funds. And so, on average, we're receiving 4.3 of these additional appropriation petitions per day. So this is a relatively common process that a number of units go through. All right. So before we switch to an overview of the current process, there's one more piece of information I want to share in this particular section, and that is that while the department is responsible for the certification of budgets and the review and approval of additional appropriations, it is the State Board of Accounts that has the statutory responsibility to ensure that units are not overspending their appropriations. If during the course of an audit, the State Board of Accounts was able to identify that you had a budget of $100, but you spent $110, and there was no additional appropriation to explain that additional $10 of spending, it would ultimately be State Board of Accounts that would include a finding on their audit report. Okay, so let's transition to the second phase of the presentation, and that is an overview of the current additional appropriation procedures. The code citation that we outlined before identifies a series of steps that need to be completed in order to receive an additional appropriation, and we're going to look at each of these 5 we're going to look at each one of the 5 bullets listed separately. The first requirement that the department needs to take a look at, or that a unit needs to consider before applying for additional appropriation, could be considered a prerequisite step. Until a unit files the 4 reports below, the annual financial report, the annual personnel report, the anti-nepotism policy, and the contract policy, the department would not be able to approve an additional appropriation that they had submitted, even if they went through the rest of the process correctly. Now, for additional appropriations that will be submitted in calendar year 2020, the department will be confirming that these 4 reports have been submitted for calendar year 18. So it's not comparing your 2020 additional appropriations to the reports that you submitted by February 1st of this year, but it's confirmation that we've received these reports back in 2018. Now, if I can speak directly to the newly elected officials who may be listening, it is likely that your predecessors have already filed these reports. If you have questions about whether or not they did or where you can find that, those questions can be directed to either your local DLGF field rep or to State Board of Accounts. They'll be able to show you where you can find that information through Gateway. If your predecessor has already filed those reports, then there would be no need to refile them. The requirement has already been satisfied. If those reports haven't been filed, it'll just take a couple of clicks in order to get that information submitted so that any additional appropriations you submit would be available for consideration by the department. Okay, so assuming that the prerequisite step for the report filing has been completed, the additional appropriation process is relatively straightforward. Step 2 in the process deals with public notice, making sure that taxpayers are aware of a unit's intent to increase their spending authority during the course of the year. And there are 2 major steps to that public notice. The first one is the notice must occur not less than 10 days before the public hearing on the proposal. And so when informing the public, we want to make sure they know 10 days in advance of the public hearing where they're going to be discussing this additional appropriation. The second requirement deals with where that notification will be published. And so statute is clear that additional appropriations need to be published in the newspaper. If in your local jurisdiction there are 2 newspapers, the notice must be published in both. If there is only 1 newspaper published in your jurisdiction, then 1 newspaper will be sufficient. The public notice itself contains the information that you would expect. It needs to include both the time and place of the public hearing. It needs to list each fund number, and the total proposed additional appropriation amount that is being considered. And the third one is that it needs to also include a categorical breakdown of the proposed additional appropriation for each fund. So what does that mean? When going through the budgeting process, a listing of your planned expenditures during the course of the year is summarized or is reported on what's referred to as the Form 1. The Form 1 includes the State Board of Accounts definitions for the major budget classifications. What's meant by number 3 is, in addition to telling the public that you're planning on doing an additional appropriation in, say, your general fund, you would need to provide them additional information to say what that increase will be used for. Will it be used for personnel services? Will it be used for supplies? Will it be used for capital outlays? This requirement is designed to make sure taxpayers are informed of what this increase is going to be pledged to. Now, if you don't already have templates, the DLGF, your local field rep, can provide you templates that can be used to complete this public notice requirement, including the number 3 of a sheet that will show how to report those categorical breakdowns. All right. So after completing the public notice, the unit is able to move on to the public hearing. And so, in this case, they've waited the 10 days. They are having the public hearing at the time and the place that was advertised. During the course of that meeting, the proper fiscal body will need to take official action to either approve as stated, modify and approve, or deny the proposed additional appropriation. They generally do this in the form of passing a resolution that confirms the amount that was advertised as the additional appropriation that they'll ultimately be seeking from the department. If the additional appropriation is either approved in whole or partially approved locally, the next step will be for the unit to complete the certified copy of the additional appropriations, sometimes referred to as the certified copy, and other times just referred to by its form name of Form 55819. Now, Today we're not going to do a deep dive into that particular form, but the department has posted a memo on our website that goes through that form line by line, identifying what is expected to be included on that line, where that can be found, how it's going to be calculated, and how that will be used. How that will be used to make the determination of whether or not the additional appropriation can be approved by the department. The certified copy is split between 4 sections and 22 lines of data. Once the form is completed, it is ready to be submitted. Once the form is completed and signed, it is ready to be submitted to the department. The department has set up 2 different ways for a unit to submit. You can scan the form and email it to the address on the screen, or you can fax the certified copy directly to the fax number that's on the screen. Now, once the department receives the certified copy, we're going to work our way through the 3 steps on the page. The first thing we're going to do is validate that the notice, the public hearing, and the resolution requirements were all satisfied, meaning there wasn't 6 days between the notice and the public hearing. The resolution wasn't adopted early. If we find that the notice, hearing, or the resolution requirements weren't satisfied, then we would ultimately end up denying the additional appropriation and returning it to the unit. Step 2 is we're going to work our way through the certified copy in order to confirm that there are sufficient revenues to support the additional appropriation request. And so the third one that we're going to do is make sure that the form was completed and signed when it was sent in. Okay. All right. And so we mentioned before that we would be looking at the way that the department treats funds 3 times. Earlier we looked at it from where you can find the appropriation. On number 2, we're going to look at it in terms of how the department determines how to respond to an additional appropriation. And so if your fund meets the criteria below, it is likely a DLGF certified fund. And so the Motor Vehicle Highway Fund, or the Highway Fund, the Local Road and Street Fund, the Library Improvement Reserve Fund, or sometimes referred to as the LIRF, School Education or Rainy Day Fund, or the catch-all category of any fund that they could have property taxes pledged to it. If the fund that you're submitting for the additional appropriation request satisfies any of those 6 requirements, you are going to receive a written response from the department. It will outline how much was asked for on the additional appropriation. It will outline how much was approved by the department, and will ultimately even contain a signature from the commissioner of the department. This is the sort of support that a unit would provide to the State Board of Accounts when they came in for the audit, to show that they have successfully completed the process to increase their spending authority, to increase their appropriation, or to increase their budget during the course of the year. For the non-certified funds, they're going to go through a slightly different process. Now, last year, House Enrolled Act 1427 altered the department's response requirements. For any non-certified fund, and so like we defined before, well, this is going to be your grant funds. This could include your home rule funds. The additional appropriations are approved upon submission. The department no longer has to officially respond to the non-certified funds. Now, to be clear, a unit still has to go through the steps that we've discussed before. They still need to advertise. They still need to have a public hearing. They still need to take formal action to approve that additional appropriation, and they still need to submit it to the DLGF. The only thing that 1427 changed was that the department no longer has to approve and respond to the non-certified funds. Okay. So everything that we've discussed so far in the first 24 minutes of this presentation are the same procedures that have been in place since July 1 of 2019. We haven't seen any changes so far, and so let's talk about what changes we're proposing for 2020. Now, for 2020, the department is changing the submission, review, and response procedures for additional appropriations. Like we discussed on the prior slide, the State Board of Accounts reporting, the public notice and the public hearing steps are unchanged and still need to be completed in order for additional appropriation to be received or approved. The only change we're looking at making in 2020 deals with how you'll submit to us, how we'll review it, and then ultimately how we'll respond to any additional appropriation requests that we receive. Now, while you can't see this in Gateway currently, the slide that we're looking at shows where you'll find this new application that the department is looking at rolling out. Our go live date will be April 1st of 2020. That's when you'll be able to see this application on the left side of the screen, this additional appropriation applications. And that's when you'll begin submitting additional appropriation petitions directly to the department via Gateway. Now, when we were looking at designing the application, we quickly realized that we have an effective process for submitting, reviewing, and approving the additional appropriations, meaning we didn't try to create the application from scratch. We largely based the application on the certified copy, on the Form 55819. We thought that would help with the transition from the current method to the new method if we kept as much familiarity in the process as possible. In the application, the first step is modeled largely after Section 1. This is where the unit will submit to the department information about when the board action or when the resolution was adopted. They will include when they advertised, the newspaper names and the date of the publication, and the date of the publication. It will include the public hearing date, and it will include the public hearing date. Now, the first advantage that the department believes that it can identify through the new additional appropriation application is being able to reduce the communication gap between our two groups. We can see that before any funds have been entered 2 seconds into the application, the department is already able to provide feedback. We can provide feedback to the unit as to whether or not their State Board of Accounts reports have been submitted. We can provide feedback as to whether or not the public hearing was noticed timely and whether or not the resolution was adopted timely. Each year, the department denies between 100 and 200 additional appropriations just due to typos. When I completed the certified copy, I meant to say that our public hearing was on 3/3 of 2020. I accidentally type in 3/2 of 2020. The department denies the additional appropriation, sends it back to the unit. The unit sees that they just put down the wrong date, and they send it back to the department. With the application, as soon as you've typed in the information, the department is able to confirm and provide feedback that there aren't a sufficient number of days between the date of publication and the public hearing. With that immediate feedback, if there's a change that you need to make, we can make that change without starting the process or without stopping the process and then sending that information back to you. So we're hoping that being able to provide that instantaneous feedback cuts down on the amount of time it takes to work through an additional appropriation. Okay. The second place where we think we're going to be able to save some time is the box that's highlighted below, where you will be entering which email address you want the additional appropriation response sent to. And so upon approval of the additional appropriation we were working on, the person listed in the box right there will receive a system-generated response that contains the same format of the response that comes from the department, but is not scanned and emailed and sent back at a later date. As soon as we're able to approve it, we'll find out who the unit wants us to send that additional appropriation approval response to, and immediately they're able to receive that feedback that they've been immediately they're able to receive that feedback and that report from the department, letting them know that the additional appropriation has been approved. Okay. Step 2 of the application requires the unit to report to the department which funds they are seeking an additional appropriation for. So this is similar to the information that was included on the the public hearing notice. This is where in the application you're going to select the fund or funds you are interested in entering data for. Now, the list that each unit will see when they get to this screen is customized to the unit itself, and so we are going to take information from your Form 4 and stage it onto a screen similar to the one that we're looking at. Once you have a listing of the funds that you have, the certified and non-certified funds that went through the budgeting process last cycle, it's just a matter of checking the box or boxes that are associated with this particular additional appropriation. So whether you choose to search by the 4-digit fund code number or want to search by the fund descriptions, you're able to tell us specifically which funds you're interested in doing an additional appropriation for. Now, if you have a new fund that didn't go through the budget cycle last year, there is a method in the application that will allow you to add new funds. But for starters, everyone will be able to choose from the funds that we are aware of before having to go through that process of adding funds manually to the request. Okay. Now, part 3 is absolutely my favorite part of the application. Now, step 3 of the additional appropriation application mirrors section 2 from the certified copy. Earlier, we talked about how that particular section is made up of 22 lines that are either completed through data entry or have formulas to ultimately make the determination whether or not there are sufficient funds to approve the additional appropriation. Now, if I can speak to the newly elected officials that may be listening to this one, as we go through the budget certification process, your predecessor last year submitted that information to the department. The department already has that data. Okay. As a result, since we already have the information, we are going to stage it behind the scenes in the application, so that the only 6 pieces of information that anyone will need to include on additional appropriation request in this section include the amount that's being requested, the amount that is being requested to reduce the budget by, the Jan 1 cash balance, the amount of encumbered appropriations carried forward from the prior year, the balance of any temporary loans that are outstanding as of Jan 1, or an amount that they are wishing to transfer to the rainy day fund. The other 16 lines the department will have staged for you and waiting for you as soon as you begin your additional appropriation process for that fund. Now, if the department is going to stage that information, there are 2 specific lines from the certified copy that we should discuss. The first one is row 5, which on the certified copy represents a restatement of the miscellaneous revenue. Okay. So early in the presentation, we looked at example 1, and this is the case where they advertised a budget of $100. They had $350 worth of cash reserves, no miscellaneous revenue, no levy provided to it, and adopted a budget of $100. Earlier, we confirmed that the department would certify a budget of $100, but there would be $250 worth of unappropriated funds. So what happens if there was a mistake during that certification? What happens if the additional appropriation that a unit is seeking isn't exclusively based on unappropriated cash, but a new revenue source that was previously unpledged to a fund? And so what on the screen we're looking at example 1A, where the miscellaneous revenue has increased from $0 to $50. The unit is now aware that they still have their certified appropriation of $100. In Gateway, in the reports that we've created, we have correctly identified that the miscellaneous revenue total is 0, but now there's an additional $50, or there's now a total of $300 unappropriated dollars available to the unit. The application is designed to allow units to change those miscellaneous revenue numbers. Now, this is under the current additional appropriation procedures. That is satisfied by finding a copy of your Form 2 either through Gateway or with the assistance of your DLGF field rep, making manual adjustments to it and including that with the form that you sent in. Under the new additional appropriation procedures, there will be an opportunity to either click on an existing revenue that was used in the budget certification process and increase the amount, or we can see on the green arrow to click and add a new revenue source that could be used to support that additional appropriation. One of the drawbacks or one of the weaknesses in our existing process would be that for a unit that would submit multiple additional appropriations during the course of the year, each time they would have to send in that additional information. With the new application, once you've changed your miscellaneous revenue, or once you've added a new one, that will represent the new baseline for all additional appropriations that are submitted during the course of the year. In other words, we're going to remember that you have already informed us that we'll call it the Fund R902 went from $100 to $150, so you won't need to keep entering it. Again, that's not going to change what we use to certify it. It's not going to change what was originally reported in Gateway, but that additional information will be used for each additional appropriation that is submitted to the department during the course of the year. I should also mention that this is not a required function of the additional appropriation. Just we know that this is not a required function. If your additional appropriation is based exclusively on unappropriated dollars that the department is already aware of, this step can be bypassed in the application. It's just available if necessary. The other line that we should have a discussion about if the department's going to default information is line 8, which is where the circuit breaker information is housed on the certified copy. Now, circuit breaker is an extremely complicated topic worthy of its own 60-minute webinar discussing what it is and what it represents. For the purposes of this presentation, let's say that the circuit breaker is an amount of the levy that you're never going to collect. Now, the reason why we need to factor that in is, as we looked at, is one of the things that the department is considering during the course of its additional appropriation approval is the amount of property tax pledged to the fund. If there is a portion of that levy that is not going to be collected, we want to make sure that we don't approve more spending than is justified by the revenue. And so on the certified copy, there is a standalone line where the circuit breakers aren't reported. In the application itself, you're going to see the circuit breaker number will change during the course of the year. If a unit submitted, next year, if a unit submits an additional appropriation request between February 1st and April 1st, the circuit breaker amount that will default into the application is the same amount that was the amount that will default into the application is the amount that was used when estimating was the amount used on the Form 4B when estimating the impact that the circuit breaker will be in the upcoming year. If an additional appropriation is submitted between April 2nd and December 31st, the department is going to default in the actual circuit breaker as certified by the county auditor during the abstract certification process. If you submit early, we're going to use the best estimate that we have available. But as soon as we have the actual impact, we are going to replace that estimate with a much stronger figure. Now, this means that hypothetically, a unit could go through the additional appropriation process on February 2nd, enter in a series of values, and have their additional appropriation approved. But had they gone through the exact same process with the exact same numbers 2 months later, that additional appropriation may be denied as we replace the circuit breaker estimated value with the actual circuit breaker. This is a complicated topic. I just wanted to introduce it here. We'll make sure that we outline our expectations or where you can find that information when we release our formal user guide and manual for the additional appropriation application. Okay. So for the third time in the presentation itself, I wanted to talk about the non-certified funds. For those, the department does need to collect as much information as we did earlier. For the non-certified funds, or any non-certified funds that were selected from the fund menu that we looked at the beginning of step 2, all you'll need to do is enter the amount for the additional appropriation and click Save and Continue. Because it is approved upon submission, because the department does go through the same validation process that we do with the certified funds, all you're going to do is report to the department the amount and then click Save and Continue, and we will have everything that we need to approve that additional appropriation. Okay. The last step of the application will require the submitter to electronically sign the additional appropriation petition. This is very similar to how the department submits information in other applications like the budget application in Gateway. They'll enter their name, their title, and then they'll enter their electronic PIN number. They'll click Sign and Submit, and that will trigger the review process on the department's end. Okay. So those are the changes that we are looking at doing. That is an overview of the changes and how the additional appropriation application will work beginning on April 1st. It is, again, not designed to be a full and comprehensive walkthrough of each of it. There's still a number of very specific topics that we didn't cover, like how transfers are handled, how the approval process will work, how additional appropriations for either debt service funds or bond proceeds will be handled. All of this information will come out on FAQs and in the user guide that the department will be posting throughout the month of March. I did want to cover 3 sort of staged FAQ questions within the presentation itself. These questions are only 3 of the many that are included on the FAQ that will be posted. The first one is the easy one of, will I have to use the new online method for my additional appropriations? And the answer to that is yes. The department will continue to process any and all additional appropriations that are submitted on or before March 31st. Any additional appropriations that are received by the department after March 31st will be returned to the unit with instructions on how to complete this online process. I do want to point out that says received before March 31st. So if a unit were to complete an additional appropriation in February and then submit that to the department on April 2nd, we would return that because of when it was received, not when the additional appropriation was entered. Okay. The second question comes up pretty frequently of what is the deadline for submitting additional appropriation? And that is a hard question to answer, largely because statute doesn't have a deadline for submitting additional appropriations. What it does outline is that the department has 15 days to review an additional appropriation and respond to the unit as to whether or not that additional appropriation is approved or denied. The department has interpreted that to mean that any and all submissions received before December 16th of the year would give the department the 15 days that we have to review and approve that additional appropriation. For the last 3 years, we have done our best to approve any and all additional appropriation that were received on or before December 31st, which means as we are working through the budget certification, if we receive an additional appropriation on December 30th, we will do our best to get that reviewed and approved before the end of the year. It doesn't give us our 15 days, but if we've had the ability, or if the department's had the bandwidth to approve those additional appropriations, we've tried to do that. Once the application goes live, you will have access to an application that is open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. On Thursday, December 31st at midnight, the department will plan on closing down this application for the calendar year, which means that any additional appropriations that you would like to have approved before the end of the year will need to be entered into the application before that date. If a unit goes through the additional appropriation process, but does not submit it to the department, it does not count as a completed additional appropriation and could lead to a difficult conversation with State Board of Accounts. Okay. The last question is, if you have any questions about the new procedures, who should you contact? And there's two groups that can begin fielding questions for you about the new application. The first one is your DLGF field representative. There's a link below that will take you to the map to show you, based on county, which field rep that you should contact. The other email address is the one listed below, the gateway at dlgf.in.gov. Now, as of March 3rd, we are still working on training our staff so that they can understand what's expected, how the new application will work, what they'll see. We will simulate what you'll see on your end, so they'll be able to take you through the process. As we work our way through the month, they'll have a better understanding of how the module works and what role they can play in providing support to units that will begin submitting their additional appropriations through the application on August 1st of 2020. Okay, that is the end of the presentation. I want to thank you for